Scotland's history is long and bloody, with wars and battles being fought in every corner of the country, repelling invaders, inter-clan wars, and hundreds of years of fighting the English. Now this has left us in our present state, where you can be just about anywhere in Scotland, and not be more than a few miles from a legendary battle site. The sheer quantity of blood spilled in Scottish soil almost guarantees the emergence of many a restless spirit. And it is not unheard of for travellers to see phantom armies trudging to eternal wars. The echoes of blood-curdling screams and the war cries of many a famous clan can be heard on the wind during the dark and cold nights. Soldiers returning to find those they have loved and lost, or dark spirits born of the atrocities and horror that took place on many a battlefield. Scotland is littered with such tales, and none so famous as the Phantom Regiment of Killiecrankie. Laying only a few miles from Pitlochry is the beautiful glen known to all as the Pass of Killiecrankie. The pass was carved over many hundreds of years by the River Garry, and now sits on the north side of a small village by the same name. Looking at it now, you could never believe that such a calm and idyllic place was the site where thousands of men lost their lives. The Battle of Killiecrankie took place on the 27th of July in 1689, and was part of the First Jacobite Rising. Now the Jacobites were the followers of James II and VII, the rightful heir to both the English and Scottish throne. But there was one issue with James. He was a Catholic, and lived in a country where the Kirk, or Church of Scotland, a Protestant faith, held sway with over 95% of its current population. The people feared a Catholic dynasty, and so ousted the king in favour of his Protestant daughter and her husband, William of Orange. This split both countries, not only along religious lines, but also along political and philosophical. Many believed it was wrong to oust a king who had a true blood claim on the throne. Others demanded that their ruler not persecute them for their religious beliefs and allow assaults on the current church. Those that advocated for the restoration of the Catholic House of Stuart were named the Jacobites, and those which upheld the Convention of Estates, which made William III King of Scotland and England, were referred to as the government forces. But there was also a very powerful third group that, for obvious reasons, would join the side of William of Orange. These were the Scottish Covenanters. Now these Covenanters were a Scottish religious and political movement who supported, above all, the Church of Scotland. They would establish their own standing army and become involved in many wars, battles and political struggles during the 17th century. And by the time of the First Jacobite Rebellion, they were obviously angered by the idea of a Catholic king. And not only that, but they saw this as an opportunity to aid the new regime in return for religious and political freedoms under William of Orange. Now, of course, this is a very simplistic view of the Jacobite Rising of 1689, and if you would like to know more, I encourage you all to read into the matter yourself, as I find it incredibly interesting. But this sets the political feelings and the background for the Great Battle of Killiecrankie. The Jacobites for some time now had taken part in many small battles all throughout Scotland, and were over time gaining more support for the cause of James. Helming the Jacobean forces was one John Graham of Claverhouse, Viscount of Dundee, or Bonnie Dundee as he was known to his men. Dundee was hated by the Covenanters, as he had fought with them before under Charles II. This gained him another name, and he was known among this religious group as Bloody Clavers, and hunted throughout all of Scotland. Now Dundee's right-hand man and second in command was the famous Ewan Cameron of Lochiel, a man of legendary status in Scotland, with thousands of his own tales and stories, but we'll save them for another time. Now during the summer of 1689, Lochiel and Dundee were at camp when they received the news that a great force of Covenanter troops, backed by William's Dutch forces, were heading their way, and by morning would be marching through the Pass of Killiecrankie. Now strangely, it is on this night, before the battle even began, that the spirits begin to rise. While Bonnie Dundee slept within his tent that evening, he was startled awake by a crack of lightning, and before him he beheld a ghostly figure with a gruesome head wound. The figure raised a pointed finger at the man, and called in a haunting tone, "Remember Brown of Priest Hill." Now the shocked Dundee knew exactly what he meant. Brown was a Covenanter, a traitor to the true crown, and a man who Dundee himself had killed some years before. And now the very same man stood before him. He knew this for what it was, a premonition of his doom. It told him that he would die in the coming battle. But being a true Scotsman, Dundee cared not, and in the morning would lead his men against the false king's army. Once Dundee's forces caught sight of the government's men, they realised that the Jacobites were heavily outnumbered, but they also had two great advantages. Firstly, they knew the battlefield and the surrounding land. Secondly, they were able to form ranks on the steep and rocky slopes of the pass, terrain the Highlanders were extremely comfortable fighting in, and the perfect position for the dreaded Highland charge. At 8 p.m. that evening, Dundee gave the signal, and 3,000 wild Scots poured out of the trees and thundered down the steep slopes. During the great charge, the Covenant army of over 5,500 men fired 3 volleys of musket into the oncoming Highlanders, felling over 600. But once the Highlanders closed the distance and arrived in the Covenant ranks, they massacred the troops in hand-to-hand combat. And it was just as this charge collided that the Jacobean cavalry hammered the right flank of the panicked Covenant soldiers. And it was here that a stray musket ball caught Bonnie Dundee under his arm, leaving the great leader to bleed to death on the battlefield of Killiecrankie. But his great victory that day would live on in Scottish history forever. The government and Covenanter troops fled Killiecrankie, leaving over half of their men dead or dying within the bloody pass. This marked the end of the battle, and in many ways the end of the first Jacobite rising. With Dundee no longer at the head, the rebellion seemed to fall apart, and the Highlanders, including Cameron of Lochiel, returned to their homes and bided their time till the next rising. With the ferocity of the Highland charge, the musket fire, and the massacre of Covenant troops, it left well over 3,000 bodies to rot upon the pass of Killiecrankie. So much blood and so much anger would have to leave a mark on the land, and it is believed that every evening on the anniversary of the battle, the grass of the pass is stained blood red. Some have said this is merely a trick of the summer sun, but others have told of crimson stains upon the hands of those who touched the grass that night. It would seem that powers beyond mortal understanding remember the violence and the bloodshed of that horrible battle. Now, almost dating back to the time of the battle itself, people have been telling strange tales of ghostly apparitions that haunt the bloody pass. Some mention the far-off sound of musket fire and the echoing screams of dying Highland men. Others tell of headless Covenant officers walking the path, still hunting for any Scotsman loyal to the Stuarts. But by far the most famous of stories comes from the first-hand account of a young woman who claims to have seen the Phantom Regiment of Killiecrankie. During one autumn, not so long ago, a young woman was on a cycling tour of Scotland and had just arrived in the village of Killiecrankie, determined to visit the historic pass. She prepared for herself a picnic and headed to the pass on a bright sunlit morning. She would spend that day walking over the steep and rocky slopes. The woman found herself a comfortable spot and relaxed in the warm breeze. She would spend so long contemplating the vicious battle and the contradictory peace of Killiecrankie that the darkness of night suddenly fell upon her. She quickly packed her things away and mounted her bicycle, but it was then she was seized by an intriguing notion. She had plenty of food remaining, and a warm blanket, and the night was mild and calm. Why not camp out in the pass till morning? The woman had always wanted to spend the night out in the open air, and the remote pass seemed to be the perfect place to seize that opportunity. She returned to her picnic area and covered herself in a thick blanket, and gently fell into a deep sleep. A sudden crack in the distance forced the woman bolt upright. It was a sound like that of lightning, but around her the night sky was calm. She sat still as the grave, wondering what the sound could have been. It was then the feeling of nervous dread began to wash over her, and she began to regret her night beneath the stars. Another crack sounded in the distance, and she now knew it to be gunshot of some kind. Looking in the direction of the sound, her heart almost stopped. There before her was the ragged and ghastly figure of a Highland warrior racing towards her, his thick brown hair blowing in the wind. The man was deathly pale, with a horrified expression, and he ran as if for his very life. He dashed past the woman, paying her no attention, sweat dripping from his brow, and blood running from a wound in his leg. The woman thought that the man seemed unbelievably real, down to the smallest detail. His swordless scabbard, the torn seams of his coat, and the flowing of his greatkilt. By the time the woman had turned, following the man's frantic direction, he was already some distance down the path, leaping and vaulting over the boulders on the slope. From the opposite direction came the loud rat-a-tat-tat of military drums, and soon the woman beheld the full Phantom Regiment of scarlet-clad soldiers marching into the Pass of Killiecrankie. The moonlight glittered and flashed on the steel barrels and blades as men trudged ever onwards. The very ground below her began to vibrate as the column drew near. She could now see white faces and livid, bloodshot eyes. The woman began to panic and thought the ghostly soldiers would surely spot her, and she would come face to face with all those terrible eyes. But one by one, the men passed her by, without as much as a glance. Their mournful eyes fixed straight ahead, lumbering forward with a monotonous march, until the whole regiment had passed out of sight further down the pass. Now the woman was stunned by the haunting madness she had just witnessed, but as all went quiet again, she leapt up, grasping her bag and hurriedly pushing the bicycle down the slope to the road. Yet as she did so, her eyes were drawn to the opposite side of the pass, where she could see some trees violently thrashing as if in a storm, but the night still remained calm. She stepped onto the road and took a closer look at the trees, but her shoes were caught in something below her. When she looked down, her eyes beheld a gruesome sight. The twisted and tormented corpse of a Covenant soldier, blood pouring from an open wound in his chest. She let out a harrowing scream, but as she turned to run, the poor woman was surrounded by an entire valley filled with dead and dying soldiers. Some writhed in pain, others laying stone still, and the blood slowly filled the Pass of Killiecrankie. The woman could not comprehend such horrors. Headless horses and officers with limbs removed. The foul, noxious smell of blood and death filled her lungs, causing the woman to be sick and turn faint. Rooted to the ground by sheer horror, the woman now noticed a young Highland girl with raven black hair emerging from the thrashing tree. The young Highlander carried a large basket and a long dagger. In her eyes were cruelty and joy as she surveyed the dying men. The cyclist had a strong urge to put an end to whatever nefarious deeds this young Highland lass had in mind, but she was rooted to the spot and watched as the young lass made her way over to the Covenanter general, kicking aside the weakened bodies of soldiers pleading for help. She reached the finely decorated man and calmly pushed her blade into the man's heart, rocking it from side to side in a demonically gleeful manner. The Highlander then took the man's rings, epaulets and coins and placed them in the basket before continuing to the next officer. The frightened woman could only watch on in horror as the lass filled the basket till it was near overflowing. It was then that the devilish eyes of the Highlander finally turned upon the woman. A shrill scream of rage came from the lass as she sprinted towards the petrified woman. The long blade flashed in the moonlight as it began bearing down on the solitary cyclist. The poor woman could take no more of this bloody horror, and finally succumbed to terror and fainted. Some hours later, she would wake face down upon the road which runs through the Pass of Killiecrankie. The Highland lass was there no more. In fact, all of the phantoms of the bloody battle had completely vanished, and once more the woman found herself in the early morning sun of a quiet and peaceful glen. She leapt upon her bicycle and headed home as swiftly as her legs could carry her. In the following years, she would tell many of her harrowing night on the braes of Killiecrankie, and vowed never again to sleep beneath the stars. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you to my wonderful patrons for helping me keep these tales alive. Although this tale is perhaps the most famous, it is nowhere near the only one. Hundreds of mentions of similar otherworldly experiences occurring in the Pass of Killiecrankie exist. Strangely enough, more people have told of the raven-haired Highlander. She has even appeared in the dreams or nightmares of those who visit the village of Killiecrankie or Pitlochry. It is believed by many that the dark-haired woman is an omen of death, and acts as a form of Scottish Grim Reaper. And this trope continues in other tales, where it is written that if the Highland woman places a finger upon you, you will be dead within a year, and if you see her at any time, you are to run away with all haste. In the surrounding area, many of the locals tell that these sightings and hauntings become more common and more vibrant as the night of the 27th approaches, and the veil between worlds would seem to be its thinnest during the anniversary of the terrible battle. Some even tell of a thick, near-oppressive atmosphere that winds its way down the pass, seeming to carry the weight of the bygone conflict. One extra bit of information I found while researching the story was that in 2004, a fragment of a 17th century grenade was found in Killiecrankie, which suggests that this battle was the first use of hand grenades in Britain, at least at the time of writing this. In 2015, a detailed archaeological survey was carried out in the pass, and it confirmed the location of the battle, along with many swords, muskets and bones, giving credence to just how deadly of an onslaught this battle became. To this very day, many still believe that the restless spirits of both Jacobite and Covenanter still march along the Pass of Killiecrankie, their haunting presence assailing all who dare to travel the path during the midnight hours. Sanjva.